So we are continuing our study in the book of Genesis. More specifically, we're currently looking at the life of Abraham, the first patriarch. Now, for a little bit of background, it was back in Genesis chapter 12 that we first meet Abraham and Sarah, at that point called Abram and Sarai. And for the sake of continuity, I'm just going to refer to them as Abraham and Sarah. But it was in Genesis 12 that we see God calling Abraham from Ur of the Chaldeans, out of his father's land, to make his way down to the land of Canaan. The land of Canaan, which God promises to give to Abraham's descendants. The problem was that Sarah was barren and Abraham did not have a son. But we have from Genesis 12 up until now, Abraham responding to God by hearing his words, listening to his instruction, and obeying him in faith. And in the course of these chapters, we have Abraham building altars, worshiping and meeting with Yahweh, making intercession for Lot and Abimelech, defeating northern kings while fighting the Lord's battle to rescue Lot and his family. We have Abraham trying to be the peacekeeper between his people and Lot's people. We have him eating a proto-Eucharist victory meal with and offering tithes to Melchizedek. Abraham, throughout the course of his life here, has been shown to be a type of Christ in that he serves as a prophet, priest, and king, albeit an imperfect one. We have a couple times where Abraham has failed to protect his wife, and he was deceptive to Pharaoh and then Abimelech here in the last chapter we went through, in chapter 20. And we had Abraham failing like Adam in the garden and heeding the voice of his wife by taking Hagar as a second wife and conceiving Ishmael with her. And in this, he demonstrated a failure to wait upon the Lord. All this shows us that even people of great faith can fail and fall into sin sometimes, but we have a means of reconciliation to God through our Lord Jesus Christ. And this is meant to be an encouragement to us, not a license to fail. But Abraham, throughout the whole course of this, had held strong to his faith in the promises of God concerning his seed, which ultimately is Jesus. We've had God reiterating his promises to Abraham concerning this seed, and he even sealed it in a covenant with Abraham back in Genesis 15, and the sign of circumcision given in Genesis 17. The whole story of the life of Abraham is concerned with Abraham's responding to God in faith and obedience. The promise is regarding his seed. And in an ultimate sense, this whole story, the whole Bible, everything points us to Jesus, who is the true seed. But in the immediate, earthly sense, this is all going to culminate here in the birth of Isaac. And so that's where we are today. So let's dig in. The first point is the birth of Isaac. And the Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had spoken. For Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the set time of which God had spoken to him. So here we have the Lord visiting Sarah as he said he would, and doing what he said he would. The visiting of the Lord here should not be thought of as the angel of Yahweh physically appearing to Sarah, as we have seen in previous chapters. But the Lord visiting Sarah here is a way of speaking of God's intervening upon her and miraculously allowing Sarah and Abraham to conceive. This isn't the case that God merely removed any barrenness or hindrance on the ability for them to conceive, but Yahweh is ensuring that conception was going to happen. This is certainly written in such a way to demonstrate that this is divine intervention. It is apparent from the way that it's written regarding this thing happening in Abraham's old age that Abraham and Sarah would not be able to conceive at this point naturally apart from a divine intervention. This is a reminder, these two verses here, that God keeps his promises and that his word is bond. The emphasis in this first verse is God does what he says. The faithful obedience of Abraham, though at times imperfect, has borne fruit. God delivers on his word, and what God says, it will come to pass, it will come to pass. And this brings me to a first application. And this is regarding God's faithfulness, God's integrity. We've been focused this whole time on Abraham's faithfulness in believing God and obeying him. And this certainly is always the application for us, right? But for another application, it is this, that we are called to imitate Christ. Christ is the Son of God, the second person of the Trinity. He is the image of the invisible God. And we're talking about the faithfulness of God, a God who does everything that he says that he will do. And while it's critical that we obey faithfully in light of the things that God has commanded and promised in his word, it's also important that we imitate this aspect of God and that we imitate his integrity. As Christians, we need to be people of our word. We need to let our yes be yes and our no be no. We need to keep our promises and follow through with the things that we will say that we will do. We need to be a people of integrity as our God in heaven is. And when we say we will do something, we need to deliver on that. We need to be a people that other people can count on. We need to be reliable. And as we bear Christ's name, if we are unreliable, if people can't depend on us to keep our word, then we are lying about who God is. And then we are taking his name in vain. Parents, this is especially important when dealing with our kids. We shouldn't be so quick to say that we are going to do something if we aren't sure that we can follow through with it. We can have the best intentions in the world, but if we create a pattern of saying that we're going to do something and then, oh, sorry, we just didn't get to it, then that is what's going to stick in their minds. That's what's going to start to be prevalent in their own lives. It's the principle of imitation. Children will do what you do more than what you will say. Children, just as children imitate their parents, we are to imitate our Father in heaven, who is perfectly imaged in Jesus. And it's all linked together. So the application is be a person that keeps your word and who can be depended upon. Verse 3, Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore to him, Isaac. Then Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Now Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. And Sarah said, God has made me laugh, and all who hear will laugh with me. She also said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? For I have borne him a son in his old age. So Abraham names his son Isaac. And this is because the Lord instructed them to name him Isaac back in Genesis chapter 17, and then it was reiterated in Genesis 19. The name Isaac, Yishak, means laughter. Upon hearing the promise that they were going to bear children in their old age, both Abraham and Sarah laughed at this. And now Sarah is reiterating the fact that anyone who hears about this is also going to laugh. This isn't a laughter of mockery. It's a joyful laughter of not sinful disbelief, but of joyful laughter of amazement in the miraculous work of Yahweh. Now, many of us have had experiences where we have to pause and recognize that a situation that we were in could only be explained as a God thing. We've heard stories of ministries that were on the cusp of folding because of a lack of funding, and at the last moment, a check comes in for the exact amount that was needed to keep the ministry afloat. It's moments like that we often can find ourselves laughing in amazement simply because our God is amazing. It's a reminder to all that witness or hear these stories that our God is amazing and that he cares for us. We don't have an absentee father that leads us from an empty chair. We're not deists. God has not just created all of us and then abandoned us. He is directly involved in our lives, even when we don't realize it. And even though Yahweh has been directly interacting with Abraham and Sarah, they still needed reassurance. This should encourage us that we are in good company for needing assurance at times as well. And one of the means God gives us as a sign of and seal of our assurance is the sacraments. They are a means of grace. And we have in verse 5, Abraham circumcising Isaac on the 8th day, as was commanded by God. This circumcision is the sign and seal that brought people into God's covenant family. Today in the new covenant, we have baptism. We have a bloodless sacrament. Baptism is what brings us into the covenant family of God, and it is something which we can look back upon and recognize our standing before God and the promises that are attached to it. It is what sets us apart from those who are not Christians. We are marked. It is the same as the Jew-Gentile distinction in the Old Covenant. You were considered a Jew if you participated in the covenant rights of that people. This is why Rahab and her family were grafted into the people of God, yet they were Gentiles. Our baptism, like circumcision, marks us as adopted into God's covenant family, and that is to be a reassurance for us, just as it was for God's people under Abraham and throughout the Old Covenant. I covered a lot of this when we went through Genesis chapter 17, so if you want to rehash some of that, you can go back on our YouTube and listen to that. But let's move on to the next point. Hagar and Ishmael are sent away. Verse 8, so the child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the same day that Isaac was weaned. Just so we can get an idea of the time frame, there's a lapse of a couple years from this last little section we just read and this one. We went from Isaac's circumcision on his 8th day of being alive to now when he's weaned. And we don't know exactly what time frame that is because different children are weaned at different times. But we do know that it would have been a couple of years. Verse 9, and Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, scoffing. Therefore she said to Abraham, cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son, namely with Isaac. And the matter was very displeasing in Abraham's sight because of his son. There is some debate about the interpretation regarding what exactly is happening here in verse 9 that prompts Sarah to want to send away Hagar and Ishmael. The New King James here has the word as scoffing. The Hebrew word is mitzahek, which is the verb PL form of Yitzhak, which is Isaac, or to laugh. Both Kyle and Delitzsch and John Calvin and other commentators take the meaning to be that Ishmael, who was a teenager at this time, was mocking Isaac, who was a toddler. That's one possibility. Now, the Greek Septuagint, which was the Old Testament translated into Greek, is actually very similar, meaning that the Greek meanings are the same as Hebrew, but it points out another meaning that is in the scope of that word. And it reads, when Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian who was born to Abraham playing with her son Isaac, etc. So while the English translation of the Septuagint has taken this meaning from the scope of the word to be scoffing, the scope of the Hebrew word also includes playing with or just laughing. So the two main possibilities of this interpretation are one, that Ishmael was mocking Isaac. Sarah was incensed by this because Isaac is her son and the child of promise, and she is being a protective mother. Or two, Sarah sees these two brothers playing together and gets upset because she doesn't want Ishmael to get the idea that he is an equal with Isaac. Now we kind of have to read into this situation their motives, since it's apparently a big enough deal that Sarah wants them gone. But we have previously seen that Sarah dealt harshly with Hagar and to send her away once before. There is some history here, and there are serious issues in interpersonal relationships in this household due to the sinful missteps surrounding Ishmael's birth in the first place. So it's not out of line to assume that there would still be bitterness on Sarah's part. Now, I do think that this section is a play on words, especially in the Hebrew. There's often times in Hebrew that there's a reoccurring word, at least in the Hebrew root of the word, that frame the text. It kind of flows like poetry. And if we read back in verse 3, but translate certain words as they mean in their root, it says, Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore to him, Laughter. Then Abraham circumcised his son Laughter when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Now Abraham was 100 years old when his son Laughter was born to him. And Sarah said, God has made me laugh, and all who hear will laugh with me. And then in verse 9, and Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing. Therefore she said to Abraham, cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son, namely laughter. If we read it this way, perhaps there was concern on Sarah's part that Ishmael was going to try to supplant the son of promise by the way it's written in verse 9. And we could read it this way. Sarah saw Ishmael Isaacing. In verse 6, it's like Sarah says, God has made me Isaac, and all who hear will Isaac with me. But when Ishmael is Isaacing, she says, no, not you. These are just a couple of ways we can think about this. We can't be totally sure what's taking place here, but we know that there was a dynamic there within this household between Sarah and Hagar. Something incensed her enough to send them away. Verse 12, but God said to Abraham, do not let it be displeasing in your sight because of the lad or because of your bondwoman. Whatever Sarah has said to you, listen to her voice. For in Isaac your seed shall be called. Yet I will also make a nation of the son of the bondwoman, because he is your seed. So Abraham is upset by this. Rightly so. There's drama in his home again. And Abraham is, for all intents and purposes, a Christian. So he loves Ishmael as well as Isaac. It is his son. We can assume that Abraham's displeasure brought him to his knees in prayer, because we get this instruction from God, and we don't get a physical appearance of Yahweh here in the text. God speaks to Abraham and commands him to listen to the voice of his wife on this matter. He also reassures Abraham that he will make a nation of Ishmael as well. So we can assume that Abraham, in his displeasure, brings it to the Lord, which is what we do when we're in times of trouble. We bring it to the Lord. I believe that this Abraham was seeking the Lord in prayer, and the Lord responded to him. Verse 14, so Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water, and putting it on her shoulder, he gave it and the boy to Hagar and sent her away. Then she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. Abraham obeys the voice of the Lord yet again. He demonstrates his faithfulness. He trusts in the Lord when God tells him to send his son and his second wife away. Now you can imagine this would be a difficult thing to do, but sometimes doing the right thing is not easy. Abraham is clearly a man of faith. He has been showing this again and again, his willingness to trust in Yahweh and obey what is commanded of him. He gives Hagar and Ishmael bread and water and sends them away. Verse 15, and the water in the skin was used up, and she placed the boy under one of the shrubs. Then she went and sat down across from him at a distance of about a bow shot. For she said to herself, let me not see the death of the boy. So she sat opposite him and lifted her voice and wept. So some time has passed now since they departed from the house of Abraham, and now the water has been used up that Abraham had given to them. At this point, based on the text, we can assume that Ishmael is weak and dehydrated. Verse 15 here, where it says that she placed the boy under one of the shrubs, has led some people to believe that Ishmael is actually very, very young. Or even that this is just a retelling of Genesis 16, where Hagar was sent away the first time. Both of those understandings, I believe, are false. Ishmael, based on the timeline, is probably about 16 years old at this time, because he was 13 or 14 when Isaac was born. And now Isaac was weaned, and now he's getting sent away. So she places him under a shrub, obviously for shade. It is hot. He is dehydrated. They are in the desert. I think it's the case that he's very weak, perhaps in and out of consciousness. But Hagar leaves him there and goes about a bow shot away and turns from him as to not see him die. And it says that she lifted up her voice and wept bitterly. And I think the phrase here where it says that she lifted up her voice is a reference to prayer. I don't think this is simply saying that she raised her voice and cried loudly. There seems to be an elevation, not just in volume, but directionally. But it isn't Hagar whom is first responded to. We know that they were in Abraham's household. They were members of the covenant, so she would have known Yahweh. Not to mention that she had been spoken to by the angel of the Lord previously in Genesis 16. But moving on, verse 17, and God heard the voice of the lad. Then the angel of God called to Hagar out of heaven and said to her, what ails you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the lad where he is. Arise, lift up the lad and hold him out with your hand, for I will make him a great nation. So God heard Ishmael's voice. We don't have the text telling us what he said or that he spoke at all prior to this, but we can assume he was probably calling out for his mom, who just left him under a shrub, weak and dying, so she could go away as to not watch him die. Perhaps it was, Mom, don't leave me here. Or maybe even Ishmael, being brought up in Abraham's house, called upon Yahweh. He was raised in a covenant home. He's now a teenager. It wouldn't be a foreign concept to call out to God, especially if you're raised in a household that knows God. But that's all speculation. It doesn't say that in the text. We aren't told what he spoke or what he uttered or if he actually said words at all and he was just crying out. But the angel of Yahweh calls out to Hagar and reiterates his promise to Hagar that Ishmael will be a great nation. It says verse 19, then God opened her eyes and she saw a well of water, and she went and filled the skin with water and gave the lad a drink. This is kind of humorous to me. The place where she stopped and wept for her son who was dying of dehydration was within eyeshot of a well. Some have proposed that God miraculously just caused this well to spring up and it was not previously there. That there was no well, he speaks to her and then makes a well pop up. John Calvin is of the mindset that Hagar was so overcome with grief that she could not see what was before her own eyes. I think that's a good possibility. We can be so absorbed by our own situation that we are oblivious to see the way out of our situation, which is right in front of us. It's like when a time of crisis occurs. Some people will naturally kick into gear, something takes over, they take charge, and they do what is needed in the very moment that the thing happens. Some people, in the face of a crisis situation, freeze up and become totally incapacitated by the stress of the situation itself. The latter may have been an issue for Hagar. She might have just been completely beyond herself. Her son is dying. She doesn't want to see it. She's in the desert. She's feeling lost, crying out to Yahweh. Perhaps that's what's taking place. But verse 20, so God was with the lad, and he grew and dwelt in the wilderness and became an archer. He dwelt in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. So Ishmael grows, becomes a hunter in the wilderness of Paran, and gets a wife from Egypt. Concerning this, Calvin writes, the Egyptian wife here is kind of a prelude to the future dissension between the Israelites and the Ishmaelites. It's kind of foreshadowing what we're going to see coming up in the future. But let's move to the next point. Abraham's covenant with Abimelech. Verse 22. And it came to pass at that time that Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, spoke to Abraham, saying, God is with you in all that you do. Now therefore swear to me by God that you will not deal falsely with me, with my offspring, or with my posterity, but that according to the kindness that I have done to you, you will do to me and to the land in which you have dwelt. And Abraham said, I will swear. So here we are. We have another interaction between Abraham and Abimelech. Abraham at this time is in Gerar. If you remember last time in Genesis chapter 20, we had the repeat of the shenanigans where Abraham said Sarah is his sister and Abimelech took her into his harem. God strikes Abimelech's whole house with some kind of illness that prevents sexual contact. God speaks to Abimelech and tells him he needs to restore Sarah to Abraham and that Abraham will pray for him. And Abimelech blesses Abraham because he fears God in this situation. So Genesis 20 is the background for this interaction. Verse 23 here is kind of funny to me. Obviously, Abimelech feels like he needs to say this to Abraham because Abraham had dealt falsely with Abimelech before. But Abraham not only agrees, he swears. This is a note that Abraham makes to Abimelech. Verse 25, then Abraham rebuked Abimelech because of a well of water which Abimelech's servants had seized. And Abimelech said, I do not know who has done this thing. You did not tell me, nor had I heard of it until today. So Abraham accuses Abimelech of having something to do with the seizure of his well. And Abimelech's like, well, I haven't even heard about this till right now. Abimelech knows that Abraham and Yahweh are close, that Abraham is a prophet of Yahweh, and he knows the power of Yahweh, as was demonstrated in Genesis chapter 20. As the kids nowadays say, Abimelech does not want that smoke. But to demonstrate that Abraham is a man of his word, just like God did with him in Genesis 15, Abraham is going to make a covenant with Abimelech to seal his word. Verse 27, so Abraham took sheep and oxen and gave them to Abimelech, and the two of them made a covenant. And Abraham set 7 ewe lambs of the flock by themselves. Then Abimelech asks Abraham, what is the meaning of these 7 ewe lambs which you have set by themselves? And he said, you will take these 7 ewe lambs from my hand, that they may be a witness that I have dug this well. Therefore he called that place Beersheba, because the two of them swore an oath there. So Abraham makes this covenant with the sheep and the oxen, as was common in those days. But then he set aside 7 ewe lambs, and this was essentially an addition to the treaty that is made with Abimelech. Like, he tags this on at the end. It says that these lambs are to be a witness of ownership of this well. Abraham attaches this legal declaration stating the ownership of the well to this treaty, to this covenant. And then he calls this place where the well is Beersheba. Now, Beersheba can either mean place of the oath or place of the 7. And since both of those things are prevalent in the story, it is fitting. It has dual application. Now, what's interesting, and it may not be realized at first glance, is that this well that Abraham had just secured in this covenant is the selfsame well that God opened Hagar's eyes to in the last section. It isn't explicitly stated, but this is another example of Abraham interceding and essentially making sure that there was provision for Hagar and Ishmael. For this area in the Negev desert is where he had sent Hagar and Ishmael away to. So here we have Abraham once again imitating his father Yahweh by securing his word with a covenant and then acting to intercede for his wife and child. Verse 32, thus they made a covenant at Beersheba. So Abimelech rose with Phicol, the commander of his army, and they returned to the land of the Philistines. Then Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba, and there called upon the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. And Abraham stayed in the land of the Philistines many days. Beersheba is in the Negev desert. So after this covenant was made, Abraham plants a tamarisk tree there in Beersheba and calls upon the name of Yahweh, the everlasting or eternal God, El Olam. Remember when it says in the scriptures that someone calls upon the name of Yahweh or calls upon the name of the Lord, it means in prayer and sacrifice. It's describing worship. Abraham plants a tree as a monument and then worships God. Now this, here where the tamarisk tree is a significant place, and it's going to reappear in Scripture in the life of Isaac later on, in his dealings with Abimelech, which is going to seem eerily familiar to Abraham's interactions with Abimelech. We will see this place appear also in the life of Jacob, Elijah, Samuel, and so on. This becomes a place where people call upon the name of Yahweh. This tamarisk tree is similar to other times when it says that Abraham built an altar to Yahweh. It is a sacred place where God and man meet. And it says that Abraham stayed in the land of the Philistines many days, in Gerar. This land of Gerar is ruled by Abimelech, and Abraham has favor in the sight of Abimelech. This is a familiar theme in Scripture, where a man of God in a pagan land rises to a place of importance in the sight of a pagan ruler. We will see this later in one sense with Moses, but more similarly to the life of Joseph with Pharaoh and Daniel with Nebuchadnezzar. And the important thing about these individuals, namely Abraham, Joseph, and Daniel, is that they stay faithful to Yahweh even in this pagan land in the sight of the pagan ruler. In closing, here's an application. We have seen throughout the duration of our time, looking at Abraham's life, since his call from Yahweh, that he has been faithful and obedient, even when it doesn't seem to make sense. This has been a reoccurring application in this series. But what I want to emphasize here is Abraham's obedience and faithfulness is in a pagan land. He is in Gerar, which is overseen by Abimelech. As we had just mentioned, this is a reoccurring theme. This should be an example for us, since we are in a land ruled by those who don't have a fear of the Lord. And even though we had examples of Abraham trusting his own innovations and not waiting upon the Lord in telling first Pharaoh, then Abimelech, that Sarah was his sister to preserve his own life, the Lord worked it out for his good in spite of Abraham's actions. But besides those examples of poor judgment, Abraham is continuously faithful. And now Abraham is being faithful in Gerar, the land of the Philistines. We are in a pagan land ourselves. We are in a land that celebrates murder, all kinds of immorality. We use flowery language like women's health and sexual freedom and equality. We live in a land with a government that wants to kowtow to Israel. We also want to let Muslims come to power and raise Islamic calls to prayer in our city streets. We have a supposedly conservative party that gives lip service to conservatism while playing into the devil's hand by either doing nothing or going right along with the madness. But our duty is to be faithful regardless. But we are to be faithful to Yahweh. We are not to compromise on our convictions, no matter who is in power. God is faithful, and we are to remain faithful to Him. We are to be a blessing to the nations, and we do that by being steadfast in our faithfulness. Our job is to love God and to love our neighbor. We are to radiate Christ likeness. And in being marked as a Christ follower and living as a Christ follower, we are a witness to the watching world around us. Now, most of us will never have an audience with the Abimelechs or the Pharaohs or the Nebuchadnezzars in our day. But our witness, our day-to-day witness, is just as powerful, if not more, with those whom the Lord has placed in our sphere of influence. These are the people that we come into contact with day after day. And that starts with our own family. You ever notice how someone's energy can affect those around them? Often it's seen in a person who's very negative, anxious, crabby, can come in and just suck the life out of a room. The same goes for joy. How we carry ourselves is contagious. Now, a person can be a faithful Christian and not be totally self-aware of how they come across. And really, the crux of what I'm getting at is faithfulness. What I'm saying is that people around us see how we respond to things in our world, and that can affect how they respond to things in their world. We are first and foremost to remain steadfast in our faithfulness to Yahweh. And we are to be continuously grateful for all the blessings that we do have. And we're to not be dwelling in a black-pilled state of discontentment because things aren't exactly the way that we want it to be. And when we are being faithful and content and grateful, then we are not being dour, pessimistic, glass half-empty people. And we can project that joy of the Lord. Christ has won the war. Now, our job is to fight the daily battle with our own flesh and show the watching world that Christ is King and that we are faithful to Him. And we need to remember that even though we may not realize it, the world is always watching. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.